long before the first cities were built, long before language formed into the shapes that would become words, and long before memory began to separate one event from another, there were the mushrooms. In the damp shadows of ancient forests, they grew silently, neither plant nor animal, something in between, something patient. And it is there, somewhere within the forgotten age of humankind's earliest wandering, that the first relationship between humans and mushrooms began. It was not discovery in the way one might imagine, not a sudden realization or a conscious event, but a slow unfolding, and unrecorded familiarity formed through hunger, curiosity, and accident. People, then not even people as we understand them, would have touched, smelled, and perhaps tasted these strange things that sprouted overnight after rain, that seemed alive and yet not moving, that grew from death itself. No one knows when the first human hand reached down into the wet soil and plucked a mushroom. It might have been a child playing with the earth, or a mother searching for food, or a wanderer too hungry to care about the unknown. The ancient world was full of risk. Everything that could be eaten might also kill. In that fragile balance between survival and death, mushrooms presented both hope and danger. Some nourished, some enlightened, some poisoned. And thus the long story of humankind's relationship with fungi began, quietly, invisibly, beneath the leaves of time. The earliest evidence of human interaction with mushrooms does not come from words, for there were no words yet, but from fragments, tools, residues, traces in cave sites where ancient hunters gathered. Archaeologists have found spores embedded in prehistoric grindstones, chemical hints of fungal presence in ancient teeth, and images, perhaps of mushrooms, carved into the walls of caves in Spain and Algeria, dating back over 9,000 years. These are not definitive proofs, but they whisper of a knowledge older than history. In those ages, mushrooms were not food in the ordinary sense. They were symbols of mystery. They appeared without seeds, grew in darkness, vanished without reason. To early humans, such things could not simply exist by chance. They must have come from somewhere, perhaps from the spirit world, perhaps from the gods. The earliest myths that survived into written culture echo this ancient awe. The Maya spoke of sacred mushrooms that opened the gates to divine vision. The ancient Siberian tribes drank the urine of shamans who had consumed the fly agaric mushroom, believing the visions seen were messages from beyond. In Greece, too, the word mykos would give rise to mycology, and yet long before it became science, it was magic. Over millennia, mushrooms became part of ceremony, part of survival, part of story. The ancient Egyptians are said to have considered them a food for the gods, forbidden to commoners. Roman emperors dined on them with suspicion and desire. Claudius, as history tells, was poisoned by one. In China, the reishi mushroom was known as the elixir of immortality, sought by emperors and monks alike, not for intoxication, but for eternal life. The same pattern repeats again and again: wonder, danger, reverence. But to speak of mushrooms only as objects of myth is to forget the deeper, quieter truth that humans and fungi have always been bound together beneath the soil. When ancient forests rose, fungi formed networks through their roots, trading nutrients, linking trees in silent conversation. And humans, wandering above, began to follow the same invisible map. The first farmers learned, without knowing why, that crops grew better in places where rot had once lived, where mushrooms had fed on decay. Compost, manure, and fungal life became the unseen allies of civilization. In this slow, unrecorded evolution, mushrooms entered not only the stomach, but the imagination. They represented the cycle of life and death more clearly than anything else in nature. They grew from decay, transformed it, and turned it back into life. To touch a mushroom was to touch the mystery of transformation itself. As centuries turned to millennia, humans began to notice differences. Some mushrooms could sustain life, others could end it. The knowledge of which was which passed through whispers, through rituals, through mothers teaching daughters, through old men remembering old poisons. In ancient Eurasia, the Amanita muscaria, red cap with white dots, became both sacred and feared. Its visions inspired shamans. Its toxins destroyed careless wanderers. The line between divine and deadly was thin and often invisible. There are stories, though unverified, that early European hunters would test mushrooms by feeding them to animals first. Dogs, goats, or pigs became the first tasters, the living instruments of survival. In time, a kind of folk taxonomy emerged. The edible ones were remembered, the deadly ones forgotten or cursed. But the temptation of the unknown never vanished. To eat a mushroom was to gamble with the unseen. By the time recorded civilization began in Mesopotamia, mushrooms had already entered human ritual. Sumerian tablets describe offerings of dark growths to the gods of fertility. Whether these were mushrooms or something else, no one knows. Yet the symbolism remains consistent: growth from darkness, birth from decay, life from death. In India, the ancient Rig Veda mentions a mysterious drink called soma, the juice of immortality, the food of the gods. For centuries, scholars have debated what soma was. Some believe it was a hallucinogenic mushroom, perhaps the Amanita muscamia again, its red cap echoing the divine fire described in the verses. If true, it would mean that one of the oldest religious texts on earth was inspired by fungal intoxication, by visions born not of fasting or prayer, but of chemical transformation within the brain. And what of the Americas? Long before Columbus crossed the sea, the peoples of Mesoamerica were already using mushrooms in sacred rites. The Aztecs called them Teonanacatl, the flesh of the gods. Through them, priests spoke with spirits, saw the future, and communed with ancestors. When Spanish missionaries arrived, they condemned these rituals as demonic and burned the mushroom stones. But the knowledge never truly vanished. It retreated underground into secrecy, waiting centuries to re-emerge. The story of mushrooms is not linear. It does not follow a clear path from ignorance to understanding. It loops, decays, and regrows, like the fungi themselves. At times, humanity embraced them as gifts of the divine. At other times, feared them as instruments of witchcraft. In medieval Europe, mushrooms growing in a circle were said to mark the place where fairies danced. People called them fairy rings and avoided stepping within lest they vanish into another world. And yet, even then, peasants gathered mushrooms for food. Knowledge passed in silence. One wrong step, one wrong cap, and death came quietly. The fear persisted, but so did the need. Hunger has always been stronger than superstition. By the Renaissance, as Europe rediscovered science, mushrooms remained elusive. Botanists struggled to classify them. They had no flowers, no seeds, no apparent roots. They seemed to spring from nowhere, an affront to the logic of creation. Some scholars believed they were spontaneous life forms generated from rot itself. It would take centuries more before microscopy revealed spores, and later still before DNA would uncover the vast hidden kingdom beneath our feet. But humanity did not wait for science to understand mushrooms in the only way that truly mattered, through use. The peasants of Russia pickled them. The monks of China brewed them into tea. The tribes of Siberia journeyed with them into the snowbound visions of their gods. Each culture found its own relationship, its own balance of fear and fascination. And all the while, beneath the soil, the mycelium spread, networks older than language, connecting tree to tree, forest to forest. The mushrooms above were only the fruiting bodies, the brief visible expression of something infinitely larger. Humanity, too, is but a fruiting body, temporary, fragile, growing for a moment upon the earth. The question of when humans started using mushrooms, then, has no single answer. It is not a point on a timeline, but a relationship that began before memory. To ask when is to misunderstand the nature of the thing itself, for mushrooms have always been there, waiting, and humanity merely discovered what was already part of the world's design. They fed us when we were hungry. They healed us when we were sick. They deceived us, enlightened us, destroyed us, and taught us. In their silence, they offered a mirror. And perhaps in some strange way, we are more like them than we care to admit, spreading unseen, surviving through decay, transforming the dead into the living again and again. The story continues, but not in a straight line. For the more we learn, the more we realize how little we know. As the centuries drifted onward and kingdoms rose and fell, the human understanding of mushrooms remained shrouded in ambiguity. In the quiet corners of Europe's forests, peasants gathered them without names, guided only by memory and intuition, while scholars debated endlessly whether fungi belonged to the realm of plants or to some separate kingdom of decay. It is strange to consider how little was truly known, even as people relied on them daily. In a world where so much was written about the stars and the heavens, few dared to write about the things that grew in the dirt. Mushrooms were too common, too mysterious, too close to death. During the medieval era, superstition wrapped around them like moss. Monks who studied medicine recorded them in secret herbal manuscripts, labeling some as safe for the poor and others as poison of the devil. The fly agaric, brilliant red and white, was known but misunderstood. Those who dared to eat it spoke of visions, of fire, of music heard in the silence. But such stories were dangerous. To see visions was to invite suspicion. To speak of transformation was to risk accusation. And so the knowledge of hallucinogenic mushrooms drifted into whispers, hidden under layers of fear. But the peasants never stopped collecting. Hunger does not wait for understanding. In the cold northern lands, mushrooms were dried and stored for winter, boiled in broth, fried in animal fat, preserved in vinegar. Each village had its own lore, its own small system of safety, learned through tragedy. Every generation lost someone who ate the wrong one, and so, generation after generation, the knowledge sharpened, not through science, but through sorrow. Meanwhile, across the world in China and Japan, a different relationship was unfolding. There, mushrooms were not simply food, but medicine, balance, and harmony. Taoist alchemists wrote of Lingzhi, the mushroom of immortality, claiming it grew only in pure air, far from human corruption. It was not meant to intoxicate, but to prolong life. Monks gathered them from mountainsides, believing that by consuming them they aligned their spirits with the eternal order of the universe. The philosophies of East and West diverged sharply here. While Europeans feared mushrooms as tools of witchcraft, the East revered them as instruments of enlightenment. But science, slow and persistent, was beginning to awaken. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the invention of the microscope revealed the unseen world. For the first time, spores could be observed, delicate dust that floated invisibly through the air. The assumption that mushrooms were born spontaneously from rot was slowly overturned. They were not miracles of decay, but organisms with life cycles, with patterns, with purpose. Still, even as classification advanced, the cultural imagination refused to let go of the old magic. The age of enlightenment wanted everything named, measured, and explained, but mushrooms resisted. They grew in darkness, in damp corners, appearing and disappearing unpredictably. Scientists could not easily cultivate them. Unlike seeds, they would not sprout under controlled conditions. The mystery of their growth humiliated the logic of the laboratory. They belonged to chaos, to shadow, to a realm beyond human certainty. In time, however, the stubborn patience of naturalists prevailed. They began to map species, to draw them in notebooks, to compare forms and colors. Latin names multiplied: Agaricus, Boletus, Psilocybe. Still, the meaning of their powers remained hidden. The hallucinogenic varieties remained largely unknown to the Western world, or at least unnamed in polite company. The sacred use of mushrooms in the Americas had been buried under centuries of conquest and silence. But in hidden ceremonies in mountain villages of Oaxaca, the rituals continued. The flesh of the gods was still consumed, still speaking in visions to those who listened. It was not until the mid-20th century that the modern world rediscovered what the ancients already knew. In 1955, R. Gordon Wasson, a banker turned amateur ethnomycologist, traveled to Mexico and witnessed a Mazatec mushroom ceremony led by the curandera Maria Sabina. His account, published later in Life magazine, shocked the Western imagination. The old stories of divine mushrooms, once dismissed as superstition, returned as scientific curiosity. Soon, chemists isolated psilocybin, the active compound responsible for visions. Laboratories, once silent about such things, became places of altered consciousness. But before that rediscovery, the world had already been reshaped by another kind of fungal power, one invisible, one medicinal. In 1928, Alexander Fleming noticed that a mold growing accidentally in his petri dish killed the surrounding bacteria. That mold was penicillium, and from it came penicillin. Suddenly, fungi were not symbols of decay, but saviors of life. The same family that rotted bread could now heal infection. Humanity, long fearful of mushrooms' power, had finally turned that power to its advantage. From that moment, fungi stepped quietly into modern history. They were studied not for magic, but for medicine, for agriculture, for chemistry. The same networks that nourished trees became metaphors for connection, cooperation, and resilience. Scientists began to understand that the forest was not a collection of individual trees, but a single living web held together by mycelium. The term Wood Wide Web was coined centuries later, but the reality had been there since before humankind.
And yet, the ancient allure never faded. The 1960s brought a new wave of exploration, not in caves or temples, but in mines. Psilocybin and LSD entered the vocabulary of culture. People who had never set foot in a forest now spoke of oneness, of eternity, of visions that echoed the shamanic experiences of forgotten tribes. The cycle repeated itself again. Revelation, fear, suppression. Governments banned the substances, scientists retreated. But the spores of curiosity had already spread. If one looks back across time, a pattern emerges, a kind of rhythm between fear and fascination. When knowledge deepens, reverence fades. When ignorance returns, mysticism grows. Mushrooms sit precisely at that border, where science and spirituality blur. They are too biological to be purely symbolic, too mysterious to be merely biological. They belong to the threshold between worlds, and that is perhaps why humanity cannot stop returning to them. To understand mushrooms is to understand humility. They remind us that life is not controlled by what we see. Beneath the ground, invisible threads determine the fate of forests. Beneath civilization, invisible histories shape belief and ritual. Each age thinks it has discovered mushrooms anew, but in truth, they have been rediscovered countless times, as though the memory itself decays and regrows, like the fungi's own form. There is a certain irony in this. The beings that live by decomposing memory are also the ones that erase it. The stories of sacred mushrooms, the rituals of ancient tribes, the visions of shamans all return and vanish like seasonal fruitings. They cannot be preserved. They rot, they return, they are reborn in another place, under another name. Perhaps this is why history feels circular when we speak of mushrooms. Each attempt to define them leads back to mystery. Each scientific explanation opens another door. Even now, when DNA sequencing has mapped thousands of species, the vast majority remain unknown. The forest floor holds secrets older than civilization. The mycelial networks under our feet are measured not in meters, but in miles, spanning entire landscapes, breathing, communicating, feeding life in ways still half understood. The oldest known organism on Earth is not a tree or an animal, but a fungus, a honey mushroom in Oregon, stretching across thousands of acres, thousands of years old. It grows slowly, quietly, unnoticed, its fruiting bodies rising and dying every season, while the true being lives on underground. Humanity measures time in centuries. The fungus measures it in decay. When did humans start using mushrooms? The question continues to echo. It is not about beginnings, for beginnings are illusions. We never began to use them. We have always been part of their world. They digest what we leave behind, turning death into soil, soil into life. In the end, we too return to them. The cycle is complete. The story is not linear, but fungal, branching, spreading, dissolving boundaries. If civilization were to vanish tomorrow, the fungi would not mourn. They would simply continue, feeding on ruins, restoring balance, preparing the ground for whatever comes next. In that sense, they are both our ancestors and our inheritors. We walk upon their world, not the other way around. And so the story goes on, not with an ending, but with a soft continuation. The mushrooms do not finish their tale. They wait, patient as ever, for the next rain, the next decay, the next curious hand to reach down into the soil and begin the cycle once more.
Deep, slow, emotionless, calm narration with slight ancient curiosity. The silence of history has a peculiar weight when it concerns things that grow without noise. The story of mushrooms is a slow unfolding of that silence, the same silence that lives beneath fallen leaves and old stones, a silence that remembers more than words ever could. When people began to settle, when wandering gave way to farming, the bond between humans and fungi deepened in ways they could not have explained. They turned the soil, they stored grain, they kept animals, and everywhere in that process fungi followed, unseen, feeding on leftovers, transforming waste into something fertile again. The first farmers, though they did not name it, were already working with fungal power. The smell of earth after rain, the sweetness of compost, the damp richness of rot, these were the quiet foundations of civilization. In the ancient granaries of Mesopotamia, mold crept into stored barley and wheat. To modern minds, that might seem like a problem, but it was in those spoiled stores that fermentation was born. Bread, beer, and eventually antibiotics all traced their lineage to fungi. What began as contamination became creation. Civilization itself is a story of learning to live with decay. The same invisible organisms that ruined food also taught humans how to preserve it. Out of rot came nourishment. Out of loss came discovery. In ancient Egypt, the scribes recorded rituals for brewing and baking, not knowing that yeast, a single-celled fungus, was the true worker behind the process. They thanked the gods for fermentation, for transformation, for the magic that made grain rise and liquid bubble. The gods, as it turned out, were microbial. Yet humanity, being what it is, preferred the mystery. The idea of divine intervention was far more poetic than the truth of invisible spores. The Greeks and Romans inherited that legacy, though they gave it new names. They spoke of Dionysus, of Bacchus, of divine intoxication. The wine they worshipped was another gift of fungus, yeast turning sugar into spirit. But the mushrooms themselves, those that grew in the forests and fields, remained symbols of ambivalence. Some emperors loved them to the point of addiction. Others feared them as instruments of murder. When Emperor Claudius died, poisoned by his wife's ambition, it was said that mushrooms made him a god. In those words, sarcasm and reverence blended into one. After the fall of Rome, as Europe entered the long, dim corridors of the Middle Ages, the mushroom retreated into folklore. In forests left to grow wild again, mushrooms flourished, and so did the tales that surrounded them. Fairy rings became marks of enchantment. Peasants avoided them, believing they were the dancing grounds of spirits. The connection between mushrooms and the other world deepened. Where rational knowledge faded, imagination filled the gap. In those centuries, every strange growth, every sudden appearance of fungi after rain became an omen. The natural and the supernatural were not opposites, but mirrors of each other. It is interesting that the same period in which Europe feared mushrooms, Asia cultivated them with care. In Japan, shiake mushrooms were grown on logs, carefully tended by farmers who had long understood the cycles of decay. In China, mushrooms were described in medical texts not as poisons, but as balancers of the body's inner energies. There, the relationship was one of partnership, not dread. While the West saw corruption, the East saw harmony. The fungus, to them, was a mediator between heaven and earth, death and rebirth. Centuries later, when trade routes connected the continents, these philosophies began to mix. Dried mushrooms from Asia reached European markets, strange and exotic, prized for flavor, and believed to hold mystical properties. European travelers wrote of them with both admiration and confusion. They described forests glowing after rain, the earth breathing with life, yet still few understood what they were seeing. Science lagged behind observation. The Renaissance brought with it the hunger to classify. Everything needed to be named, ordered, placed within a system. Plants, animals, minerals, all were arranged into neat hierarchies. But mushrooms refused to cooperate. They blurred the lines. Were they plants? They had no leaves. Were they animals? They did not move. They seemed to exist outside the order of nature itself. Some scholars, unwilling to accept uncertainty, simply left them out of their catalogues. For a time, mushrooms existed as the unclassifiable other. Even as science advanced, the old fear remained. In the 17th century, during outbreaks of ergotism caused by a fungus infecting rye, entire villages convulsed in madness. People saw visions, screamed of demons, burned suspected witches. The fire of St. Anthony, as it was called, came from ergot poisoning, a fungal toxin that constricted blood flow and twisted minds. Whole histories of hysteria and persecution may trace their roots to that tiny organism feeding quietly in the grain. In that sense, fungi did not just feed humans, they shaped their behavior, their fears, their myths. The witch hunts of Europe were, in a strange biological irony, fueled by fungus. By the Enlightenment, thinkers began to strip the world of its mysteries, but fungi remained stubbornly elusive. Even when microscopes revealed their spores, even when the first mycologists tried to map their family trees, there was something unsettling about them. They fed on death, thrived in darkness, appeared suddenly, vanished without trace. They were, in the eyes of reason, reminders of chaos. To study them was to confront the limits of control. It was not until the 19th century that mushrooms began to enter the scientific mainstream. The term fungi became standardized. Species were described, catalogued, pressed into books. But still, their larger story, how they connected life and death, remained invisible. The Industrial Revolution, obsessed with machines and progress, had little patience for decay. Factories replaced forests, and with them went the quiet understanding of cycles. Yet beneath the new cities, the same networks continued. The mycelium does not care for human ambition. It feeds wherever there is waste. When the 20th century dawned, humanity was surrounded by fungi in ways it scarcely noticed. Yeast brewed beer, baked bread, fermented wine. Mold spoiled food, but also produced medicine. Penicillin, the accidental miracle of 1928, transformed the relationship once again. For the first time, fungi saved more lives than they took. The same kingdom that caused rot and plague became the foundation of modern medicine. It was a kind of redemption, though the fungi themselves had done nothing different. It was humanity's perception that changed, not nature's behavior. Meanwhile, deep in the jungles and deserts, the traditional uses of psychedelic mushrooms continued. In places untouched by industrial order, shamans still gathered the sacred fungi under the moonlight, still spoke to spirits in languages the modern world had forgotten. When Western researchers rediscovered them in the 1950s, they thought it was something new, a revelation of science.
They did not realize they were merely reopening an ancient door. From that rediscovery came both fascination and fear. Psychologists saw potential for healing. Governments saw potential for chaos. The same mushrooms that once connected priests to gods now connected students to rebellion. They became symbols again, this time not of mystery, but of freedom. And as always happens with symbols, they were misunderstood. The rituals became experiments. The visions became recreation. The sacred became chemical. In that shift, something essential was lost. The understanding that mushrooms were never about escape, but about reflection. The visions they offered were not dreams, but mirrors. They showed people not another world, but the same world seen without boundaries. For a moment, one could glimpse what the fungi always knew, that everything is connected, that decay is not the end, but the beginning. As modern science delves deeper into fungal biology, that old truth re-emerges under new names. Mycorrhizal networks, carbon exchange, interspecies communication, terms that sound technical but mean what shamans once said in simpler words. The forest is alive as one being. Trees speak through fungi. Nutrients flow where needed. Death feeds life. The pattern repeats. And yet, for all our progress, we remain strangers to the soil. We pave over the ground that feeds us, poison the rot that sustains the cycle. The fungi persist, indifferent to our ignorance. They will inherit what we abandon, as they always have. After every extinction, fungi thrive. They clean the ruins, digest the corpses, prepare the ground for renewal. In the end, it is they who decide when life begins again. To tell the story of mushrooms, then, is to tell the story of humility. For all our knowledge, we have never been their masters. We are temporary guests in their kingdom. The first humans to taste them learned that through hunger. The last humans will learn it through decay. Between those two moments stretches all of history. Boring, perhaps, but inevitable. The mushroom waits. The rain falls. The cycle continues.
By the time humans began settling into early agrarian societies, their relationship with mushrooms had already stretched across thousands of years. They were no longer a mysterious forest curiosity, but had become a part of human ritual, medicine, and diet. Yet despite this long familiarity, mushrooms remained a symbol of uncertainty. A berry could be sweet or sour, but a mushroom could be life or death. This ambiguity made them a mirror for human nature. Curiosity tempered by fear. Exploration mixed with hesitation. Archaeological traces from early Mesopotamian and Egyptian sites suggest that mushrooms were often connected to gods, dreams, and the afterlife. The Egyptians referred to them as the plant of immortality. Pharaohs were the only ones allowed to eat them. It was not because they were nutritious, but because they were seen as divine, a food that did not grow from seeds, appearing suddenly after rain, emerging as if by magic from the damp earth. To the human imagination, that was enough to make them sacred. In China, records from the Han Dynasty speak of the Lingzhi, the mushroom of spiritual potency, believed to grant long life and inner peace. Scholars, monks, and emperors sought them in hidden mountain groves. The search for Lingzhi became a metaphor for enlightenment. Not everyone who sought it could find it, and even if found, it required patience and humility to consume. It was more than a mushroom, it was a lesson. In ancient Greece, philosophers like Theophrastus and later Pliny the Elder wrote about fungi with both fascination and confusion. They could not fit them neatly into categories of plant or animal. They lacked seeds, leaves, or flowers, yet grew and reproduced mysteriously. Even Aristotle's followers found themselves unsettled by these strange organisms. Mushrooms became a topic where science met mysticism, where explanation ended and wonder began. Meanwhile, in Central and South America, civilizations like the Aztecs used psychedelic mushrooms in religious ceremonies. The Teonanacalt, meaning flesh of the gods, was consumed to communicate with spirits. Spanish chroniclers, upon witnessing these rituals, described them with both horror and awe. The colonial suppression that followed pushed these traditions underground for centuries, but the memory of their power never disappeared. In medieval Europe, the relationship with mushrooms grew darker. The forest became a place of both livelihood and fear. People gathered mushrooms for food, but superstition ran deep. Many believed that rings of mushrooms in the grass were signs of fairies dancing. Fairy rings, they called them. To step into one was to risk being taken to another world. The connection between mushrooms and mystery deepened again, not through reverence, but through folklore and caution. In the Renaissance, the study of natural history revived curiosity. Artists painted mushrooms in the corners of still lifes, symbolizing mortality and the fleeting nature of life. Scientists began to catalog species, though they still struggled to understand how fungi fit into the grand taxonomy of creation. By the 17th century, mushrooms were both studied and feared, symbols of decay, disease, and transformation. In the Enlightenment, brought new methods, but not yet full understanding. Microscopes revealed spores, suggesting a hidden reproductive system. But it was not until the 19th century that fungi began to be classified properly. The line between edible and deadly remained uncertain, leading to tragic mistakes among explorers and botanists. Even now, centuries later, the fear of misidentification lingers. The knowledge that nature hides both food and poison in the same form. In the early 20th century, the scientific study of mushrooms expanded rapidly. Mycology, the study of fungi, emerged as a distinct field. Researchers discovered antibiotics like penicillin, derived from fungal molds, changing the course of medicine forever.
what was once a symbol of mystery became a key to survival. Yet even as science advanced, the cultural echoes of ancient awe remained. The mushroom was still a bridge between life and decay, between the known and the unseen. And by the mid-20th century, another chapter began. Psychologists and philosophers rediscovered the ancient rituals of psychedelic mushrooms. Experiments in the 1950s and 60s explored their effects on consciousness. Figures like Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley turned them into symbols of spiritual awakening and rebellion. Governments reacted with fear, banning their use, but the curiosity never stopped. The cycle repeated: curiosity, fear, control, rediscovery, just as it had thousands of years before. And now, in the modern world, humans grow mushrooms in sterile laboratories, engineer them for medicine, and even use them to make biodegradable materials. Yet the wonder remains the same. A mushroom grows silently, invisibly beneath the soil, until one day it appears, perfect and strange, a reminder that not everything needs to be understood to be beautiful. Because from the caves of prehistoric hunters to the laboratories of modern scientists, the story of mushrooms is not just about food or drugs or medicine. It is about curiosity itself, that quiet, ancient instinct to reach for what we do not fully understand. And perhaps that is why humans never stopped using them. They are not just part of nature's history. They are part of our own.
In the quieter corners of industrial history, mushrooms appeared again, not as mystical symbols or culinary curiosities, but as silent workers in the machinery of human progress. The 19th and 20th centuries were ages of coal, steel, and steam, but even there, in the damp tunnels and abandoned mills, fungi found their place. They grew where light could not reach, breaking down the forgotten waste of human ambition. Spores drifted into cracks of old buildings, colonizing rotting wood and rusting iron. Unseen, they digested civilization's leftovers. While humans measured time by invention, mushrooms measured it by decay. Scientists studying these humble decomposers began to realize that fungi were more than background organisms. They were engineers of the Earth's recycling system. Long before humans built factories, fungi had been dismantling forests and returning life to soil. In every dead tree, in every fallen leaf, they continued their ancient work, silent, tireless, and impartial. If humans were the architects of progress, fungi were the custodians of balance. Without them, the world would drown in its own remains. During the wars of the 20th century, mushrooms made unexpected appearances. In the trenches of World War I, soldiers noticed strange molds growing on damp boots and uniforms. It was an inconvenience at first, then a symbol of the rot that crept through the endless mud of the front lines. Later, during World War II, the discovery of penicillin, derived from the Penicillium mold, changed everything. A small, accidental growth in a forgotten petri dish saved millions of lives. A war fought with steel and fire was quietly turned by a fungus that grew in silence. The irony was not lost on historians. Civilization had always viewed rot as the end of things, yet in that moment, decay had given birth to healing. penicillin became a symbol of hope, and behind it stood a lineage of fungi stretching back through the damp forest of prehistory. The same family that decomposed corpses on the battlefield could also save the wounded from infection. It was as though nature, indifferent and eternal, had decided to remind humanity that destruction and renewal were never separate.
After the war, the world changed again. Industrialization accelerated, cities expanded, and science turned its eyes toward the microscopic. Fungi became the subjects of deeper study in genetics, agriculture, and pharmaceuticals. Their mycelial networks, invisible yet vast, were compared to neural networks and even to the structure of the Internet. The more humanity learned, the more it seemed that fungi had always been there, quietly connecting the world in ways people were only beginning to imagine. In art, mushrooms returned as quiet metaphors. Painters, poets, and filmmakers began to see them not as simple plants, but as emblems of impermanence and hidden growth. The surrealists found in their forms a symbol of the unconscious, soft, alien, and strangely beautiful. Post-war writers used them to describe post-industrial decay, the spreading, silent growth beneath society's polished surfaces. Even in modern science fiction, fungal imagery persisted. Spores taking over planets, colonies growing in the ruins of civilization. Humanity could not stop imagining fungi because they represented what humans feared and admired most: persistence without ego, creation through destruction. In the late 20th century, researchers discovered new possibilities. Certain mushrooms could break down plastic, oil, and toxic waste. Mycologists like Paul Stamets began to argue that fungi might help repair the planet that humans had damaged. They could clean soil, restore ecosystems, even serve as food sources for the future. The same ancient organisms that once fed hunters in the forest could now perhaps help humanity survive its own excess. Yet the cultural perception of mushrooms never entirely changed. For many, they remained strange, suspicious, too easily linked with poison and hallucination. Supermarkets offered neat white button mushrooms, stripped of mystery, while the wild varieties stayed in the domain of foragers and dreamers. The modern world had tamed fungi, or thought it had, by packaging them into plastic and labeling them by weight. But in the quiet corners of the earth, in forests, landfills, and underground labs, the true world of fungi continued, endless and unseen. And so, as the 21st century unfolded, the story of mushrooms and humans entered another phase. Fungi were studied as potential medicines, as building materials, as analogues for artificial intelligence. Scientists spoke of mycelial networks as models for decentralized thinking. Philosophers wrote about fungal intelligence, the idea that coordination could exist without hierarchy, communication without language. It was unsettling, but also strangely comforting. In a time obsessed with control and clarity, mushrooms offered a lesson in patience and ambiguity. They grew where they were needed, fed on what was available, and connected what seemed separate. It is said that civilization began when humans learned to plant seeds. Perhaps it will endure because they learned to understand decay. For in every cycle, from birth to rot, from invention to ruin, fungi have been the quiet companions of human history. They were there when fire was discovered, when empires rose and fell, when war and healing traded places. They are there now, beneath the streets, beneath the forests, beneath the farms and skyscrapers, a living memory of everything that has ever died and everything that will grow again. And perhaps that is the true answer to the question of when humans started using mushrooms. The truth is, they never stopped. They have always been using them, not only with their hands, but with their minds, to think about life, to fear death, to understand that both are made of the same quiet, spreading network beneath the surface of things. In the contemporary age, mushrooms have transcended mere survival or ritual. They occupy laboratories, kitchens, forests, and even the imagination of technologists. Researchers study mycelium not only for its biological properties, but as a model for complex systems, observing how networks operate without a central command, how resources flow efficiently, how connections are formed invisibly and persistently. The world of fungi offers a metaphor for life itself, decentralized, resilient, adaptive, and patient. The same organism that fed early humans, healed them, and inspired visions now instructs engineers and designers on principles of sustainability and cooperation. In cities around the world, fungal-based materials are replacing plastics, insulating buildings, and creating biodegradable packaging. Farms grow mushrooms as both food and medicine, while scientists explore their potential to purify water, absorb toxins, and remediate environmental damage. The very earth beneath human infrastructure, once ignored, now draws attention for its silent, living complexity. Fungi, which have always existed in the shadows, are emerging as teachers of modernity, illustrating that growth need not be linear, and that life thrives through cycles of decay and renewal. Culturally, mushrooms remain symbols of mystery. The red-capped fly agaric still evokes visions of the sacred and the hallucinatory. In literature and art, they symbolize transformation, ephemerality, and hidden networks of life. For thousands of years, humans have projected onto them stories, fears, and dreams. They appear in folklore, religious texts, science fiction, and popular culture alike. They remind humanity that the smallest forms of life can hold lessons far beyond immediate comprehension, that survival, adaptation, and interconnectedness are not human inventions, but natural processes observed in the quiet work of the Earth's decomposers. From prehistoric forests to modern laboratories, the story of mushrooms is inseparable from the story of humans. They have shaped diets, inspired mythologies, cured diseases, and taught philosophy. They have been feared, revered, ignored, and celebrated. Yet throughout all ages, one constant remains. Mushrooms exist on their own terms, indifferent to human agendas, patiently performing the work of life and death. In this, they offer both humility and instruction, a lesson in the slow, steady unfolding of existence. So when did humans start using mushrooms? The question may be less about chronology and more about relationship. Humans did not discover mushrooms once. They have been rediscovering them ever since, in forests, in temples, in laboratories, in kitchens, and even in the mind. The interaction continues, a continuous dialogue across time, a network of knowledge, fear, curiosity, and necessity. In the end, the mushroom waits, as it always has, patient, silent, resilient, and utterly indifferent, a quiet witness to human history and to the ongoing cycles of life itself. And thus the story of humans and mushrooms closes, not with an ending, but with continuity. Every hand that touches the earth, every mouth that tastes, every scientist who studies, every poet who imagines, becomes part of a long lineage of interaction. The mushroom, in its simplicity and complexity, embodies the same lessons that have persisted for millennia. Life is fleeting, death is constant, and transformation is inevitable. In that quiet, persistent truth, humans have found both sustenance and wisdom, and perhaps a mirror of their own place within the greater unfolding of the natural world. The cycle goes on, endlessly, as it always has, as it always will.